All right. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday. Is everyone thinking about the weekend yet? You guys have plans? Is the plan to do nothing? It's like sleep in, sleep, eat, Netflix, sleep, eat, or whatever. No?
Wait, sleep.
Just sleep? Just like one thing? Yeah.
What do you?
Yeah, I'm gonna do a bit of the same, I think. For the past few weeks I was getting up at like 9 or 9:30, and now I'm getting up at 6:15 or 6:30, so that's a bit of an adjustment. So I think I may sleep in a little bit on the weekend just to catch up. I'm gonna go get some hot chocolate because there's a hot chocolate festival on in Vancouver, so I'm gonna get a fancy flavor of hot chocolate. And I'm gonna change the thermostat in our house. Very exciting. If it works. If it doesn't work, it's gonna be very cold and very not exciting, but we'll see. Let's see. So Crazy-O is here. Good morning, Crazy-O. Hello. Let's start in kind of where we were yesterday. So yesterday I was telling you we're just kind of laying the groundwork here. We're talking a little bit about theory and perspective. We're introducing some words or terms that we'll need to know for the rest of the course. I know it's a little dry at the moment, but don't worry, it gets more exciting from here. We talked yesterday a little bit about what social justice was, and to be honest, we were pretty much able to define what it was, right? We were talking about how the social part is the people around us, the society around us. The justice part is fairness, right? Is doing things that are right and sort of trying to fix things that are wrong. And I've provided a little more detail here about the idea of believing in human rights and the kind of equal worth of people, the idea that society has a lot of resources, right, and opportunities, and we want to try to spread those around. If we're interested in social justice, we want to spread those resources around a little bit, right? But we also talked about the idea that we probably don't want a world of perfect equality, right? Number one, that's probably not possible because we're all different, right? And we're all kind of talented or gifted at certain things. We don't want a soccer team full of average players. That's not inspiring to anyone, right? We don't want to go in for an operation and have the surgeon be, just somebody who wanted to be a surgeon, right? We want the best, right? In some places we want the best. We want things to be competitive. We actually want to discriminate, right? Barcelona is very discriminatory in who makes their squad, right? They make sure they get the best players they can possibly get. And we kind of want that, right? But we don't want that case. We don't want people discriminated against for the social groups they belong to, right? That's kind of what social justice is talking about. Yesterday I talked about kind of three theoretical mindsets, right? The idea that we were going to look at things in a critical fashion, and what that meant is that a lot of things that humans believe and know and act upon are socially constructed, right? They're true because we all agree them to be true, right? And sometimes that has to do with the value of money. We all agree that $20 is $20, and so it works, right? We're able to exchange money that way. We'll talk very shortly about gender roles, right? We have a bunch of rules that men are supposed to follow and boys are supposed to follow, and then a bunch of rules that women are supposed to follow, right? And again, sometimes we can break those rules a little bit and kind of get away with them. Sometimes we can't, but most of those rules are just made up, right? They're invented by a society. but we'll come back to that. We talked about the idea that society is stratified, right? A strata is a layer. And so I think we all intuitively know that society has levels. Some people have very little money or power. Some people have lots and lots, right? We were talking yesterday a little bit about the idea that our perceptions of the world are not all the same, right? We're all kind of looking at the world through our own lenses, right? And those lenses are kind of made of our upbringing, our culture, our family, our socialization, which we'll talk about very shortly, but also the social group that we belong to, right? I'm a guy, right? I'm a man, and I kind of look at the world from that perspective, right? And of course, the world also sees me from that perspective as well. They see me as a man, at least I hope, and they treat me that way as well. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I get treated as that. Right? And then we talked about the idea that knowledge is sometimes counterintuitive, right? So sometimes the things that are true are not the things that seem like they should be, right? And so to kind of illustrate that, yesterday we talked about the idea of the flat earth, which we all saw this immediately and knew that it was incorrect. This is not what our world looks like. This is not what our planet looks like. But, you know, if you didn't know, right, if you didn't know the science, you might be forgiven for thinking that it was, right? Because it looks flat, right? And you actually have to kind of pay attention and observe carefully to actually see evidence that it is, in fact, round, right? And so the idea that Earth is round that's counterintuitive. Seems like it's flat, right? But of course, because of science, because of pictures from space, because of experiments that we can do here, we know better, right? But it seems flat, at least to me. So we talked about that. And the other thing I want to talk about here today is the idea of critical theory as applied to knowledge. Okay. Now, this is a little tricky, but I think we're okay. I think we're ready for it. The idea here with critical theory and critical theory of knowledge is that sometimes we like to think of the things we know as objective facts, right? They have no bias, they're just information, right? Whether it's any fact you can think of, any fact you can think of, we like to think of it as free of bias, free of anything. It's just a pure piece of truth, right? And sometimes that's the case, but when we look at it through the lens of critical theory, what we're looking for is the sort of things that are attached to knowledge. Let me show you what I mean here. This will make sense at the end. So, what we're looking for is the meaning that we give to information, right? So, you all know many, many things, I am sure, but what we're going to do is question the meaning of information. Let me give you an example. This will make sense. Hang on. Do you have any idea who this guy is? No? Not a clue? Guy with a funny hat? Maybe he just had some spicy food for lunch? Oh, gosh. No. Teasing. This is Christopher Columbus. Okay. Have you heard of him before? Yeah. Pretty famous guy, right? Almost as famous as Drake. Pretty famous. Was an explorer, right? Set out. I keep getting confused. I think he set out from Portugal, but anyway, set out from Europe in the 1400s, the late 1400s, in an attempt to do what? Well, I guess I wrote it right there. In an attempt to find a route to India, right? So at the time, let me see here. Do I have a map? Oh, I do. Good. At the time, Europe was doing a lot of trading with with India and with China in the Far East. There was lots and lots of money to be made, and so Europeans wanted to be engaged in trade with these areas. But the problem is that to get to India, you had to go around the bottom of Africa. And if you know anything about the sea down there, it's very treacherous, it's very rough. Lots of ships sank there, and so, lots of European merchants would load up their ships with, huge amounts of money and goods to trade with India, sent it out, never saw it again, right? And in fact, that's where insurance gets invented, believe it or not. Companies appear in Europe and in Britain that start insuring these shipments because merchants don't want to send their stuff out, because if it vanishes, then they have no more money. So insurance is kind of invented because of this situation. But anyway, so the only way around was around Africa, and so people started to think there's got to be another way, right? There's got to be a safer way we can get to India. And so Christopher Columbus's plan, of course, was to sail directly west in the hope that he would land over there in Asia, right? And would find a safer, maybe even a faster route to India. It's kind of a funny looking world map, isn't it? But for 600 or 700 years ago, it's not bad, right? It's not bad. So that was the plan, right? That was Christopher Columbus's plan. And again, if you know anything about history, you'll know that he sailed off in 3 ships, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria. They sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually they made landfall. Well, they made landfall. They bumped into a mass of land, right? And went ashore, looked around, thought they were in India, right? Saw a bunch of people running around, said, "Hey, look, Indians." Turns out they weren't Indians, because he hadn't arrived in India, right? Where he had discovered something that Europeans knew nothing about, right? An entire continent. I don't have a map in my presentation here. I think he probably landed somewhere in the Caribbean, probably the Dominican Republic or Haiti. That's probably where he originally where he bumped into the land. But of course, he and other explorers followed him, started to explore all of North and South America. Countries began to colonize, right? Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, right? All these countries started to come over and take over pieces of North and South America. We kind of know the story from there, I think. So this is the guy, right? This is Christopher Columbus. Now, the story that I've kind of told you here is mostly what school children have learned or used to learn growing up, right? And so who's Christopher Columbus? Well, he's this brave, heroic explorer, right? Set out across the Atlantic Ocean, discovered the New World. Some people add into the story the idea that he proved the world was round, right? He sailed off and attempted to sail around to India, right? Of course, you can't do that. There's something in the way. But sometimes this proving of the world is round is part of the story. And he also has a holiday in the United States. And so Columbus Day, that's a couple of years out of date now, but it's in October, mid-October. They do Columbus Day in the US. We don't do it here, but they do it there. So that's kind of the story. Does that kind of align with what you know about Christopher Columbus? Yeah? Is there anything I've missed in the story? Is there stuff that you know that I haven't included here? No? No? That's the story as we know it? Okay. Okay. So it's true. That is the Christopher Columbus story. And let me just see what my next slide is here. Right. So the Columbus story, if we look through it through a critical lens, what we're trying to look for is socially constructed meaning, right? So what is the meaning behind this story? Why is it told? And why are the details kind of selected? Why are the details of this story selected, right? What does this story mean? Who benefits if we believe this story, okay? And who doesn't benefit? Who maybe is hurt by the belief of this story, okay? That's what we're looking at. We're not really looking at, is it true? Because I think, we can probably agree that these things are all true, right? Did he sail from Europe and arrive in North America? Absolutely. Indisputable historical fact. He did that thing. Was he an explorer? Yes. Was he brave? I think you'd have to be to sail off in one of these rickety wooden things across the Atlantic Ocean. Keep in mind, most sailors didn't know how to swim. Not that it matters if your ship goes down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, you're not swimming home. But there's no lifeboats on these things, right? So I'd say he was pretty brave. I think that's a dangerous thing to do, to sail off into the unknown. Did he prove the world was round? Unclear? No? Why not? That's true, right? Real proof would have been if he actually arrived in India. Then you would know for sure, right? If he bumped into something else, maybe he just bumped into something else before going over the edge, right? So you're right. He didn't exactly prove it by not going all the way around. That's true. It's true that he has a holiday for sure. These are all facts for the most part, except maybe the world is round part. They're all true, but the question is this the only part of the story, right? Is there more to this story? And of course, there 100% is. Okay. Now, let me just back up and I'll tell you the rest of the story. So, Christopher Columbus did arrive in the New World. He looked around, and I wish I had a quote from his journal, from his diary, but he said something to the effect of, wow, look at these people running around here. They have no technology. They're quite friendly. They have no weapons to speak of. We could enslave them and make them do whatever we want. Right? That was like his first thought, right? Was like, oh wow, I could totally enslave these people, right? And kind of enslave them he did, right? If you look back at historical records, the place where he landed, which is now Haiti in the Dominican Republic, it was called Hispaniola at the time. That's what they called the island. Christopher Columbus became the governor of Hispaniola. And by all accounts, he was awful. He enslaved the indigenous people that were living there. He executed them for any sort of crime he thought they committed. He kidnapped them. He sold young girls into sex slavery with traders and explorers. He was a horrible guy. And even by 1492 standards, right? In the year 1500, it was a much more brutal world than what we live in now. But even by those standards, he was a crappy guy, right? He was awful. And so, for the people of Hispaniola, he was terrible, right? And actually, I think eventually he was removed from his governorship because he was so bad. The crown said, okay, you're out. You're making a mess of this. You're terrorizing people. It's not good for business. You're out. So he actually got kicked out, I think. But so for the people of Hispaniola, terrible, right? But if you also know anything about the history of North and South America, you'll know that for, part of the idea was that, wow, Europeans had discovered this, open, untouched, pristine land, right? But of course, that wasn't really the way it was, right? It was actually full of indigenous people, right? All the way from the Arctic here to the southern tip of South America. There were all kinds of different people, different tribes, living in different ways, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, right? And so this land wasn't empty, it was populated. It was populated by indigenous people. And for indigenous people, the arrival of Columbus is kind of the beginning of the end for them, in a way, right? So after Columbus, more explorers start to come, more traders, more treasure hunters, more colonists, more warriors. And basically what happens is that their people are enslaved, their cultures are destroyed, their lands are taken, and it's the end of their way of life, right? For many, many indigenous groups all throughout the Americas, right? The arrival of this guy is the beginning of the end, right? And so my kind of point here is that how you think of Columbus or who you think Columbus is, in some ways depends on who you are, right? The Americans, for instance, like to tell the story of Columbus the brave explorer, right? Because he kind of fits into their history. He fits into their kind of narrative, right? What's the history of the United States? Well, brave colonists came from Britain, right? They fought against the monarchy, right? Because the monarchy was oppressive and controlling. They fought off the British monarchy. They established their own country, right? It was a harsh country, a rugged country, but the Americans, worked hard and made it their own and made it into the great country that it is today, that people look up to and kind of want to be like. Maybe or maybe not, but maybe not right now. But that's kind of the American story, right? And Columbus kind of fits into that, right? He's a founding father. He came here, he sailed across the ocean, a dangerous undertaking at the time, arrived here and started to make a life, right? Started to tame the wilderness, right? He made something out of nothing and was brave and strong and persistent, right? He fits into the American story that way, and that's kind of why he gets his own holiday, because he fits into that story that the Americans like to tell themselves. But again, if you ask indigenous people in North and South America, do you think they feel the same way? Well, they don't, right? Again, he is the beginning of the end for their people and their way of life, right? He's not responsible for everything. He's only one man, right? I suspect if he didn't discover if he didn't discover the Americas, someone else would have, right? It's only a matter of time. But yeah, he's the beginning of the end, right? It seems like he was a pretty awful person to begin with, but then it sets in motion the process of their cultures being destroyed, the taking of their lands, not to mention the Atlantic slave trade, which actually is fueled by the discovery of the New World, and that has lots of negative outcomes as well, right? Not just for indigenous people, but for Africans and others. So both kind of pieces of this Columbus story are true, right? Is he a brave explorer who set out across the sea and found the New World? True. Is he a horrible person who set into motion a slave trade and the destruction of indigenous cultures? Also true, right? So how you kind of choose to look at him depends on who you are, right? the events and the details of this story that you assemble and then you teach has power, right? And so, again, lots of American school children, maybe not so much anymore, but used to learn the first version of Columbus, right? He's a brave explorer, right? Who discovered the New World. And of course, did he discover the New World? No. Indigenous people kind of knew it was here, right? It had been their home for 10,000 years, right? So it wasn't really discovered. Europeans discovered it, but Indigenous people, yeah, they lived here for a long time. So he didn't really discover it. He didn't really prove the world was round, right? As Avitesh said, he didn't actually go all the way around, so he didn't really prove it. Plus, if you didn't think the world was round to begin with, would you just sail off in one direction? If you thought the world was flat? No, it's a suicide mission, right? Like, if you honestly believe the world was flat, and Europe is here, and India is here, would you sail straight that way? No, you'd be a crazy person, right? You'd go over the edge and die, right? So nobody would do it. And again, people already knew the world was round at that point. But the idea of the world being round is also worth talking about, right? Because, I've said that already, so I'm just going to jump ahead. People like to include this in the Columbus story, right? He discovered the New World, although he didn't really discover it, but he discovered the New World, and he proved the world was round. But if you look, earlier in history, Europeans definitely thought the world was flat, right? And that that idea was supported by the church, right? Because at the time, that's where knowledge came from, right? If you wanted to know something, you went to the church, right? You talked to the priests. At the time, they were probably the only people who could read and write. Most of the written records were kept in the church or in monasteries. Churches were kind of the center of learning, right? And so prior to maybe the 14 or the 1500s, let's say the 1400s, if you wanted to know something, you went to the church. Good morning. Because knowledge came from up there, right? Knowledge came from God. But during the Renaissance in Europe, people started to kind of rediscover philosophy and ancient Greek writing, and they kind of rediscovered science, right? And science, of course, is the idea that knowledge doesn't come from up there. You can actually create knowledge, right? If you observe the world carefully, right, you can figure out how it works, right? The world operates according to universal laws, and if you pay close attention, you can figure out those laws. You can figure out how it all works, right? And again, you saw, European scientists doing experiments, and a couple of them start to figure out that, hey, we don't think the earth is flat. We think it's round, right? And of course, they got a lot of pushback. They got a lot of resistance from the church, right? Because the church had been teaching that the world was flat, right? And if the church is wrong about the world being flat, well, what else might they be wrong about, right? And the church was a very powerful entity in this period of history. And so the church didn't want its power challenged. And so it worked actually very hard to suppress this knowledge of the round earth. But again, the strength of that kind of, of that knowledge kind of got out, and people came to accept the idea that it was round. But again, the church had an interest in making sure that people didn't believe that, right? Their power was threatened, and so they continued to push the idea that the world was flat, right? But the other reason that this kind of round earth is part of the Columbus story is part of another kind of political meaning thing as well, right? The idea that science and knowledge and technology and advancement and progress, that those all come from the West, right? The East is old, the West is new. The East is tradition, the West is innovation, right? And the West kind of likes to think of itself this way. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, I'll leave that for you to decide. But the West likes to kind of think of itself this way. It likes to tell itself this story. And so often we hear about scientists in the Renaissance in the 14 and 1500s doing experiments and starting to figure out the basic laws of physics, right? The basic ideas about how the world works. And it's worth paying attention to, and it's incredible work that's happening, and it's kind of the foundation for our scientific world today. But it's also worth mentioning that while the Europeans thought that the Earth was flat, there were lots and lots of other cultures who kind of thought the world was round already, from like a long time ago. So if you look at the ancient Greeks, for instance, they kind of thought the world was round. If you look at lots of indigenous people in North and South America, particularly the Aztecs and the Incas, they thought the world was round thousands of years before the Europeans did. The Europeans were kind of the last ones to figure it out, right? And yet the story tends to be that this is how humans discovered the Earth was round. It was the Renaissance and scientists like Copernicus and Da Vinci and all these guys. But really, they were kind of the last ones to figure it out, right? Other people already knew. But again, the West likes to tell itself this story, right? Just like the United States and Canada in the past like to tell itself the story about Columbus, because that story legitimizes them, right? It supports their view of who they think they are, right? The view of Columbus as, the destroyer of cultures and an enslaver and all around awful guy, that doesn't really fit in the American story, right? The American story is about triumph over nature and persistence and bravery and courage and freedom, right? That's what the US story is about. And, jerky Columbus doesn't fit into that story, right? But brave explorer Columbus does, right? And so that's the version that gets told, right? And for indigenous people, their part of the story gets pushed to the side, right? Because, well, Americans don't want to hear about that. And there's lots of examples of this. A similar thing happened here in Canada. Who among you know anything about Indigenous people's history here in Canada? Even just a little bit. I know you do, Chin. Okay. We will get to that. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But even with me growing up, when I took social studies in school, our history of Canada was very much like the story of Columbus, right? The story was, Europeans came here, they traded furs with the indigenous people, and then slowly they built this fantastic country that we call Canada, right? Da 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 da, and that's the story, okay? But the big chapter that was missing from that history was, well, what happens to the indigenous people, right? They're there at the beginning, we're trading furs with them and things, but then they just kind of disappeared from the story, right? What happened to them? And the thing that happened to them is the destruction of their cultures, their languages, their way of life. Their land was taken from them. They were pushed aside, right? But did we learn about that in school when I was a kid? No, we didn't. Right? And why? Well, because it doesn't really fit into what the story that Canada wants to tell about itself, right? We want to tell the story that we are, we're brave, and, we live in a country with kind of a harsh climate, but we're tough enough to deal with it. And we persisted and we built this multicultural paradise, or whatever, however you want to describe it, right? And again, that's not an entirely false story. There's lots of truth to that story, but it's missing a few pieces, right? Just like the Columbus story. It's Columbus, where kids weren't taught that he was a horrible guy who enslaved people and executed them for no reason. Doesn't fit with the story, right? We didn't hear that indigenous people were pushed aside, right, and forgotten about so that Canada could be built for white Europeans, right? We didn't hear that chapter of the story because it doesn't fit with what we want to tell ourselves about who and what Canada is, right? So the story of Canada in the past, or the story of Columbus, those aren't just a bunch of facts, are they? Right? They are facts, but they're put together into a story, and that story has political meaning, right? It has social and political meaning. The brave explorer story of Columbus legitimizes the American view of what's happened in American history, right? Is America the story of triumph and perseverance and dedication and freedom? Or is the story of America one where people who lived here for thousands of years were stripped of their land and culture and pushed aside while Europeans came in and did whatever they wanted? Right? What's the story of America? Is it the first one or the second one? And of course, I think it's both, right? Both things are true, but the story that you teach people, especially to children, has a lot to do with how society sees things, right? And even in Canada, in Canada today, I think we've made a lot of progress, but in the past, there wasn't really a lot of sympathy for Indigenous people, right? There was a lot of racism and discrimination against them, still is. And people didn't really feel sorry for them, or didn't feel bad that anything had happened to them, because most people weren't taught that anything bad happened to them, right? And so most people didn't really know. They just saw them walking around. They're like, oh gosh, here's Indigenous people, right? And again, if you teach one version of the story, it influences how people see society. But again, there's another side to that story. But the story has political meaning, right? So the point here is that sometimes it's important to think about not only whether things are true, right, but do we have the whole story? And if we don't, why not, right? What are we not being taught? What are we not being told? And why? And who benefits from us believing one version of a story versus another, right? I think we can see that, Canadians and Americans and white Europeans, we all benefit from believing Christopher Columbus was a brave explorer, right? But of course, Indigenous people, they don't see it that way, right? But if we ignore all those negative parts of Christopher Columbus, then it's more difficult for us to understand Indigenous perspective, right? It's more difficult for us to understand what's happened to other people in the past, right? So again, the Columbus story is not just about Columbus, right? And it's not all facts, and it's not free of political meaning, right? It has political meaning. And again, the fact that we're talking about this now, the fact that we have a social justice class now, should also be seen as having political meaning, right? We have a class like this because we care about this now, right? We care about equality, right? And we care about fixing inequalities between social groups, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race or religion or whatever it is. Education is a political project, right? If you took my Social Studies 11 class, I'd teach you about Canadian democracy. I'd teach you about how elections work and how the government works and the parliament and the voting. I teach you all of that stuff. Why? Well, because the government wants you to be good, democratic citizens, right? I'm not going to teach you how to be revolutionaries. I'm not going to teach you how to be dictators. I'm not going to teach you how to be communists, right? I'm going to teach you how to be good democratic citizens because that's what the government wants, right? And so education is a political project, and the things you learn are, useful and often true, but they do have a political meaning behind them, right? There's a reason that we know what we know, and there's a reason that we know it in the way that we do. Does that make sense? Complicated? It's okay to say it is. It is. It totally is. It's totally complicated. Okay, so let me just see here where we are. Okay. I'd like to take a little bit of a break now, and then we'll switch gears, I think, a bit. Okay? So take a break. Let's relax, and then we'll come back. We'll do a little more. Okay, here we go. So hopefully what is landing for you is the idea that, again, the things we know are attached to political and social meaning, right? The way we know them, the reason we know them in the first place, how those things are presented to us, all of those things have to do with political concerns, right? And who's in power is what I'm saying. So knowledge, you've heard people say knowledge is power, right? Have you heard people say that? Yeah, right? It's true. Knowing things is power, but also the ability to determine what people know and how they know it is also power, right? And so I would bet that every country in the world does this, right? They control their educational system and they are thinking about what they want people to be and what they want people to know, right? Again, in Social 11, I would teach you democracy, right? Because that's what the Canadian government wants, right? Not revolutionaries, not communists. We want people who understand democracy here. And so we'll teach you that, right? We'll teach you that for that reason. The only other thing I wanted to kind of mention here is the people who still do not believe that the world is round. Okay? There are people out there like this. They're called flat earthers. It sounds bizarre, but actually there are so many conspiracy theorists out there these days that it doesn't seem quite so bizarre. But some people honestly do believe that the world is flat. And when you tell them the earth is round, they say no, it's a conspiracy, it's a government cover-up. Those pictures that are taken from space where you can see the earth, those are all fake. It's all fake. Earth is flat. And I had a video at one time that I would show students, and I won't show it now because it's not really worth the time. But it's interesting because one of the things these people say is basically what I'm telling you, is that knowledge is attached to meaning. And when you ask these people, it's like, why is it so important that the earth is flat? And the answer that I forget if it was a guy or a woman, the answer they said was that, well, no, we're not just evolved from monkeys and we're on this tiny little blue ball that's hurtling through space at 1,000,000 miles an hour in the middle of an empty universe, right? That's not what this is. We were created by some sort of creator god, and we're here for a reason, right? And so for them, the flat earth versus the round earth has meaning, right? And it's not just the shape of the planet. It's attached to all kinds of other things too, right? The idea of what kind of a world do we live in? What is the meaning of life? Why are we here, right? Are we simply evolved from, are we a very evolved form of ape? And yes, we're on this tiny planet in the middle of space, and as far as we know, there's nothing else out there for billions of light years. Is that the story? Or is Earth something that was created by a god? And we all put onto this planet for a reason, right? That's a totally different way of thinking about our experience, right? And so depending on how people want to think about it, for these flat earthers, the idea of the flat earth has been connected to that idea of meaning, right? We are here for a purpose, right? They want to believe that, and so this flat earth thing has meaning, right? And so for them, even though most of us would say, no, you're wrong, the world is round, for them, believing in that flat earth has meaning attached to it, just like all of these other things we've talked about, right? The other thing I'll mention very quickly, because it's probably worth doing in this day and age, is the idea of conspiracy theories. Do you guys know of some conspiracy theories? Conspiracy theories? There's a bunch. Yeah, what's one? What's one conspiracy theory? Well, one is the Earth is flat, government cover-up. Another conspiracy theory? Anybody heard of QAnon? QAnon? Big conspiracy theory in the United States right now. Lots of people seem to believe it. The idea is that lots of powerful people are actually pedophiles and they run a child sex ring. Hillary Clinton, everybody, they're all involved in it. Crazy, right? But that's the one. Some people believe that the moon landing was faked, right? So the Americans went to the moon in 1965, 4? Can't remember. Anyway, some people believe it's fake. Never happened. Hollywood studio, guy on wires. They filmed it. What else? Other conspiracy theories. Oh yeah, there's lots of. Yeah, I guess end of the world could be kind of a conspiracy theory, right? Those people who, yeah, believe the end is coming, right? What else is there? Well, I'm sure the end is coming, but probably not like this week. Hope. What else is there? Aliens. There's lots of conspiracy theories about aliens, right? There's also another one about lizard people. Like people in charge of the U.S. government are lizard people or something. It's very strange. There's also the idea of the deep state, right? People that somehow the U.S. is kind of controlled behind the scenes by people. We don't know who they are, but they're very powerful and they're very hidden. The idea that Hitler used during the Holocaust, that Jews were secretly in charge of the world, behind closed doors, behind the curtain. They were controlling the world and finance. Bonkers too, but another conspiracy theory. But all these conspiracy theories, again, they have the same kind of idea behind them, right? Usually that the idea is that some people are in control, right? We don't know who they are. They're hidden, they're mysterious. We don't know who they are. They're in control of everything, and there's no evidence for this at all, right? And that's always the problem with the conspiracy theory, is when people say, well, where is your proof, right? Where is your proof that Hillary Clinton is running a child sex ring, right? And there is no proof for that because it's bonkers, right? It's not happening. But to the conspiracy theorist, the fact that there's no proof is the proof, okay? Because of course, if there were proof, if people knew about it, then it could never happen. So the fact that there is no proof is the proof, right? But then you kind of get stuck, right? You get stuck in kind of a logical circle. And you're like, well, if it wouldn't happen if there was proof, so of course there's none. These people are too smart or too powerful. And so you kind of get in a situation where you can't get out of it. You can't disprove it, right? It's bulletproof in terms of reality. There's no way you can find it to be false, because the less proof there is, the more convinced these people are that it is true. Anyway, I thought I'd mention that. Okay, so let's go to, I'm just going to jump to here because we've talked about all of this. Talked about that. Okay. So, how are we going to approach things in this course? Okay, we're going to try to follow 5 kind of guidelines. Okay, this is the last thing I have for you today. Don't panic. How do we discover the truth? How do we approach things in this class? And I'm going to say that we we'll need to do 5 things in order to engage constructively. Okay. I've got them here, but I'll go through them kind of one by one, okay? So the first one is we have to kind of strive for intellectual humility, okay? There's kind of 2 parts to this. One of the parts is that we have to recognize that we don't really know everything, and we probably don't know as much as we think we do. I don't know about you, but the further on I go in life, the more I realize I don't know. I feel like when I was 18, I knew much more than I know now. So, or maybe I've just discovered all the things that I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot I don't know. There's a lot I don't understand, right? There's a lot of things to know, right? The other thing is that some of the things we'll be talking about, are scientific, right? Even if they're not based on, science experiments and numbers and things like that. Social scientists do scientific work the same as the hard sciences, right? They have to prove their results, they have to test them, they have to make arguments. And so the science we'll be talking about here is just as rigorous, or can be just as rigorous, as physics or engineering or chemistry. Okay. The second one, we'll talk about this tomorrow, the idea between informed knowledge and opinion. Okay. Now, unfortunately, in media, and definitely on social media, and in mainstream culture, we've kind of put these on the same level, right? We've kind of put people's opinions on the same level as informed knowledge, but they are not, right? Everybody has opinions about things, and it's okay. You're allowed to have them. I have them. But opinions are generally uninformed, right? People haven't really done the work, right? They just kind of have a feeling about something, they believe it, and that's their opinion. But again, it's not the same as real, solid, researched knowledge, right? That is different, right? That is a different thing. And so we'll talk about that a little more tomorrow. But again, the idea is, opinions are not really worth much, right? You can have them, but we shouldn't just accept other people's opinions, right? We should look for reasons to believe certain things, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that tomorrow. Yeah, when we read people's opinions, we basically, or when people say their opinions, they're usually just kind of rehearsing what they already believe, right? They're not really doing any thinking. They're just kind of repeating what they already know, right? And again, when we're trying to find the truth of things, sometimes that's not that helpful, right? It's not that helpful. Number 3, we need to let go of personal anecdotal evidence, blah, blah, and look at broader social patterns. Okay, so an anecdote, if you will, is a small story. Okay, you guys, I was on the SkyTrain this morning. You'll never guess what happened. This guy, blah 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 blah. Little anecdote, right? Little short story. Those little short stories are very informative, right? They teach us things about life and about people. They're valuable experiences for us. But again, they don't really reflect what's going on in society as a whole, right? And so your experience might be very different from most other people's experience, right? Or it might be very typical of it. But really, when we're looking at social justice, right, like Chen pointed out, we're talking about society, right? All the people around us. And so something that we experience or something that happens to us might not be reflective of what most people experience, right? So we want to look at broader patterns in society, not just what happened to us, right? Because again, sometimes it doesn't reflect what's happening overall. Number 4, this probably won't happen in here. I don't think it ever really has, but sometimes people can have strong reactions to, kind of emotional reactions to talking about some of these things. If you go on If you go on social media, you'll see that people often have strong emotional reactions to the smallest to the smallest things. And before you know it, the comment section of something is filled with people yelling at each other back and forth. But the things we talk about in here can sometimes be challenging for people, and kind of for two reasons. Oops, thought I had a. Do I have it? Where is my? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. One of the reasons why people can have emotional reactions is that we're talking about things that we have been taught in our culture. Okay, so this is a little drawing of an iceberg, right? The idea that most of an iceberg is below the surface, and all of us come from a particular culture, right? And when we think about other people's cultures, and sometimes even when we think about our own, we think about the stuff that's on the surface, right? Particularly if you think about someone else's culture. You often think about the way people dress, the food they eat, their celebrations, their rituals, their language sometimes. But you don't often think about the stuff that's below the surface. But the stuff that's below the surface is the most important stuff, right? This is the way that people see the world, right? This is the things that they believe are true. These are the things about how they think the world works. And the deeper you go, the more kind of emotional investment people have, right? And the stronger the reaction that they'll have when you challenge any of those ideas, right? So food, for instance, if I take my Chinese food and put ketchup on it, most Chinese people won't be really offended. They might look at me and go like, okay, that's gross or weird, but they probably wouldn't be deeply offended, right? But if you look further down, right, concepts of the self, the definition of obscenity, right, what things are obscene and not, when you challenge age roles or gender roles or class expectations or things, those are more deeply held, right? And people will have a stronger reaction, right? If I walk in here tomorrow wearing a dress and makeup, people are going to have a strong reaction to that, right? Because I'm breaking a cultural rule that's much deeper, right? If I put ketchup on my Chinese food, nobody cares, right? It's not that big a deal. But the deeper you go, the bigger a deal it becomes, right? And so, yeah, the deeper you go, the bigger a deal it becomes. And so when we talk about things like gender and sexuality, sometimes race, sometimes religion, those things are very deeply held, and people can have a strong reaction to them, right? And so I say this because the last time I was in university, I had to take an Indigenous education class. And so we took the class. It was taught by Indigenous professors, Indigenous teachers. But a lot of the class was talking about what had happened here in Canada, right, in terms of how Indigenous people were mistreated by the Canadian government and the Canadian public. And it was really hard to hear, right, especially for a room full of mostly white education students. And so people were having emotional reactions, right? They were, they would argue with the professors, or they were like, oh, this class, I hate this class. Why are we doing this? This doesn't mean anything. Or I feel really guilty about this. What am I supposed to do? Or why is this class all about making us feel bad? People were having all kinds of stuff come up for them. And it took a long time to kind of work through it and figure it all out. But sometimes it happens. But if you're having kind of an emotional reaction to something, if you kind of feel strangely about it, first of all, if you feel brave enough to share it, I would love to know. But second of all, if you're feeling that way, probably what's happening is that what we're talking about or what we're hearing is bumping into one of your one of your beliefs, right? One of your cultural beliefs, right? And so when something bumps into that, people tend to have a reaction to it, right? And again, it doesn't matter what culture it is. Every culture has particular ideas about all these things. And when an idea comes along that's in contrast, people have a little bit of a reaction to it, right? Maybe a strong one, maybe a weak one, but it happens. And so, again, if you feel this way, you are probably bumping into a kind of an earlier belief that you have. And at the very least, just kind of notice that that's what's happening, right? It's like, oh, I believe this about this, and this idea I'm hearing is contrary to that belief, right? It contradicts it. And that's why I'm feeling a little, whatever. And the last one here is, there we go. I think I've said that already. And I showed you that. Okay, and the last one is this. Keep in mind that how we understand things, how we see things, our perspective on various issues is influenced by, to some degree, by our positionality, right? So I'm sitting up here, right, as a white male Canadian, right? And I'm going to see things in a particular way, right? It doesn't mean that I can't learn to see things differently. It doesn't mean that I see things exactly the same as every other white Canadian male, because I definitely do not. It doesn't mean that I'm, incapable of seeing things differently, but I kind of know where I come from, right? I know what my upbringing was like. I know kind of what my culture is like. And so I kind of know that I understand the ways in which I'm biased, or at least I'm trying to, right? And so keep in mind that everyone in this room is gonna see things a little bit differently. I'm gonna see things a little bit differently. And that doesn't really mean that any of us is necessarily right or wrong, right? We're all just, one of my teachers in university, he did this, and he said, who am I gonna pick? Oh, Cleo. I'm gonna pick Cleo. Okay, Cleo, how many sides of the garbage can do you see? One? Okay. How many now? You see two. Okay. How many now? Okay. So Cleo sees 3 sides to this garbage can, right? I kind of see 3 sides as well, right? I can see the back and the side, and I can kind of see inside, right? Now, Cleo and I are both looking at the same thing. We're both seeing something totally different, right? But between Cleo and I, we can see the whole thing, right? So is Cleo's view right, or is my view right? Neither and both, right? Neither of us are really seeing the entire issue, but if we talk about it, we can see the whole thing, right? So everyone's perspective has some value. It doesn't mean that they're seeing things wrong. It just means that they're looking at it differently, right? And so, the positionality has an effect on how we see things, but if we can incorporate more viewpoints, we get a clearer picture of what's actually going on. Okay? Yeah, all right. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Are there any questions about anything that we've talked about today? I know it's kind of complicated. I know it's a little dry. I have some more interesting things for you to do tomorrow. Well, maybe this is interesting. I hope it's interesting a little bit. I don't want to sell myself short. So tomorrow what we'll do is we will move on, We'll talk a little bit about critical thinking and arguments. And then once we've done that, I think we'll start to move on to culture and socialization. And that'll be an important piece because when we talked about socially constructed knowledge, basically everything that us humans know and do and think is a product of our culture and a product of our socialization, right? We are, we have some instincts, right? Us humans, we have some instincts that are wired into us, but not many. Almost everything we do is learned, right? We have learned how to do it. And so in order to kind of go forward, we have to understand how culture and socialization works. And so that is what we will talk about tomorrow. A little bit of critical thinking, and then we'll talk about culture and socialization, okay? So if you don't have any burning questions for me, I think I'll let you go. Is that okay? Okay. Don't tell Sarah. It's 13 minutes early. Don't tell Sarah or I'll get in trouble. No. Okay. That's all for today, people. Have a nice afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?